Good morning, and thank you all for coming. My name is Francis Rose, and I am the afternoon host on Federal News Radio here in Washington. I want to thank my friends at the Atlantic Council, particularly Barry Pavel and Alex Ward, for putting this together and for inviting me to be a part of it. We have a terrific panel to talk about technology and how it's impacting geopolitics. We see it, of course, in every area of our lives today, but in this area, we see Arab Spring. We also see the Chinese government able to manipulate technology like Weibo to suit their needs. Technology as a disruptor in geopolitical forces is our topic for these three gentlemen. Andrew Holland is Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis at the RAND Corporation. Thank you very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you on with us. Moises Naim, congratulations on your shout out from General Dempsey. Moises is author of The End of Power, From Boardrooms to Battlefields and Churches to States, Why Being in Charge Isn't What It Used to Be. And he is also Senior Associate in the International Economics Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And directly to my right, Dr. Matthew Burrows, Director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative here at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council. Matt, I'd like to start with you. What do you think is the most important technological change in the current geopolitical environment?
I think the most important change has been in the nature of technology itself, so that, you know, we're living in an era, I would call it the hacker era, in the sense of that being actually a positive thing as well as a negative, in that you have technologies that are very much accessible to individuals, but accessible too in the sense that they can advance those technologies. And it's less of a state-run or state-controlled world. So, you know, you find on the internet that the hackers are advancing the very nature of the technology. Unfortunately, when you're looking forward, there are a lot of, and particularly here, we've been looking at biotech, a lot of technologies that you know, can be advanced in very nefarious ways by individuals and make it very hard for states, really, and governments to know what is happening first, and then to be able to prevent some very bad things from happening.
Moises, the technology that we see is changing in a very quick curve. Moore's law doesn't even really apply that much anymore. The technological changes that you see that are most important in the geopolitical sphere?
The three most important, most disruptive military technologies of the 21st century so far have been cyber weapons, drones, and IEDs. IEDs, you know, landmines accounted for 5% of casualties in the Second World War. According to some estimates, the large majority of casualties in Afghanistan and Iran are because of, you know, were caused by IEDs. Drones, as we know, have become a very important tool. And as Craig Mundy of Microsoft is fond of saying, cyberspace is now fully weaponized. So and I'm sure there are other technologies, other more DARPA-like, GWIS high-tech technologies that I'm sure are quite disruptive, but so far, the conflicts of the 21st century have been disrupted by these three technologies. And what do they have in common? Cyber weapons, IEDs, and drones. That they are not longer under the control of the military. They're not under state control. Of course, no one that has you know, drones that are under the control of the US military or the Chinese or the Russian or the Israelis, I'm sure far more advanced and have far more sophisticated capabilities than the drone that we are going to see here in the exhibit. But drones are proliferating, and so drones are now becoming, you know, do it yourself, do it at home. You can have your own drone. And that creates unprecedented reality. So the notion that the most disruptive technologies of this century are in the hands of individuals also, or could be, are no longer monopolized and under the dominant control of states. And the military, I think, is a very important subject.
Andrew, what I take away from each of their remarks is that the most important concept behind technology is not the individual technology itself, but it's the way that technology is being used. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I think that's right. Diffusion, of course, is what is a theme you're hearing echoed here, that some of the key technologies and cost of entry with those technologies in the past was one that was in the hands of the few and now in the hands of the many. And so I think that, it is one now, it's a phenomena that I think we now have to come to understand in a very different way. The opening of societies through information technologies, I think one of the great developments of our lifetimes, but also with the opening of those societies comes, the risks because of the diffusion that we're talking, that you've been highlighting. In my own area of the work that we've been doing, I would probably zero in when you talked about technologies earlier of surveillance technologies. Moises referred to that, precision, and that comes through GPS-related issues, and then, of course, instant communications, and then the combinations of what that offers. Again, I'll go back to the point that was in the hands of the few. In fact, at the outset, it was really in the hands of the United States. And now it's not only diffused to other states, but it's really diffused to groups and individuals, and I think that raises a really important challenge for us.
So General Dempsey referred to General Scowcroft's coining of the New World Order phrase, and Andrew, I'll continue with you for a moment. How do you establish the next New World Order when ostensibly everybody can have access to everything, at least the way that the curve seems to be headed?
It's, I think we're all struggling with that basic notion. In some ways, I don't want us to overlook how we thought about issues of geopolitics and strategy in the past, because I think we do have some advantages. And looking at this from an American standpoint, we have important partnerships around the world. I think it's very important for America's voice to be heard in those partnerships right now. That's part of the order that we'll be seeking. We're in the midst of writing new rules for that order, and it's coming in ebbs and flows. But we're working on trade pacts with our European and Pacific partners. Very important that we get that work done. We're establishing rules as we move along in the use of information technologies. General Dempsey referred to that earlier. I think there's a tension to be worked out here between privacy and openness and so forth, but that's all happening. The order that's going to form, I think, still, though, has at its base some of the key partnerships we have around the world. I would say, though, one thing that been on my mind of late is that for more than 2 decades, we've been able to make choices among key areas. And so we could say our focus is on the Middle East and the Pacific, or we could say that we're interested now in rebalancing from one to the other. When we look at where key partnerships are around the world, in Europe, in the Middle East, and East Asia, I don't think we have the luxury of choosing right now.
Mm-hmm. Moises, Andrew refers to the fact that we're writing new rules for this New World Order. Do we necessarily know who all of the groups and organizations and nation states are that want to be involved in that, or that want to have a say in how those rules break out?
Right, and so the question is, who is we?
Yes.
So we are writing the rules of this new, who is we? And the point is that in this new world order, you have a proliferation of actors with the capability to block others and to restrict the options that the others have, the large ones, the big powers have traditionally taken for granted. I'm not saying that the United States or Russia or China are no longer powerful. I'm saying that the range of options, the degrees of freedom that they used to have are more constrained now. And I'm saying that there's a proliferation of these veto actors that are small enough not to be able to overtake and win and dominate, but are large enough or powerful enough to deny victory to others. What we have seen in recent wars and recent armed conflicts is the denial of victory to the very large traditional players, to the mega players, by these micropowers that have just enough power to block. And so we're going to a world in which too many players have the ability to block and not enough players have the ability to create the structure of orders and what you mentioned, the new rules. Those new rules are going to be very easily disrupted by the micropowers.
The disruption, Matt, in the environment that we live in today, it strikes me, the organizations most capable of that disruption will be the agile groups. General Dempsey talked about agility, and large nation states such as the United States, such as Russia and China, potentially may not be the most adept at being able to be agile in these environments. What does that mean for the way that we try to structure a strategy to cope not just with large superpowers, but with groups that we may not even be aware of today?
Well, I think you actually have to rethink how you do your decision-making process so that you're, and one of the things that we've been working on here in the Atlantic Council on Strategic Foresight, and also when I was in government at the National Intelligence Council, is to begin to think about the possible different futures, the possible different scenarios and trajectories, and that way then you have a better idea of what could happen, and then you also need a better decision-making process where you begin to try to develop strategies that deal with different possibilities. And that's what, it's hard to do because most of the time, and General Dempsey talked a lot about this, you're swept up in one crisis after another. So how do you get out in front? And you have very little time there to really to develop a new kind of operating style and way you do business.
Moises, those comments seem to strike a chord with you. You're nodding in agreement as he's talking about the necessity of dealing with the crisis of the day and not necessarily being able to concentrate as much as one would like on strategy.
And that's a perennial, and it has always been true. And it's a challenge, and those who have been in government know that the emergency of the day conspires and undermines the ability to think ahead, to prevent or boost the readiness for the coming. But my point is that there must be something when we have all denounced this and identified this as an issue, and it never goes away. So it may be that either the diagnostic is wrong, because we keep complaining and we keep saying, how can we go on like this? Just completely overwhelmed by the emergencies of the day and not doing enough to prepare. And that is it has become too much of a constant to be surprised by it or to complain about it. I think we need to take it as a reality and adjust, as Matt was saying, I think we need to adjust organizational structures, decision-making processes, and foresight capabilities in order to you have to start with the assumption with that those in charge of making decisions are going to be on an emergency crisis mode constantly.
Andrew, there are two faces of examining technology and the way that it impacts geopolitics. There is figuring out what you want to do and how you want to leverage technology, and there is figuring out how the other guy is going to do it. Can you talk a little bit about both sides of that and formulating a strategy that allows you to incorporate what the other guy might do and what his goals may be?
Yeah, I think it's a really important theme for us, and in my own mind, and not something I necessarily have conceived, but I've sort of gathered from others, it isn't just the ability to harness and use technologies in key areas, because it's not always those that invent first field that have the most advantage of those technologies. In fact, there's a shadow or a following event that those that can adapt and use it don't necessarily have to invent it. And I think there is an overfocus, maybe too much attention on who's going to harness, or who will field the next thing first. It's really, I think, in terms of the world of strategy making, who's going to apply it to the most effect. And so when you look at what we or our partners would want to have, the advantages that would come from that, certainly we ought to be cognizant of the notion of where we're going. But it's also, I think, being very much focused on who's going to be adapting quickly and in very interesting ways. I think Moise's reference to IEDs earlier, not sophisticated technology really by most standards. When people come to understand what it was that's behind that, this is technology that really is available to almost anyone, but it had great effect. So I think in looking at geopolitics, looking at technology, and looking at disruptions, it isn't always the leading edge of technology where we ought to be focused, but it's what's happening with the technologies that are available and then how we use and adapt to that. Very challenging.
That's a really good point, because I think folks tend to focus on the very cutting edges of technology and not think about the full landscape. So maybe it would be useful, Matt, to pull back and think about that full landscape of technology and what exactly we should be examining when we're trying to figure out what we should be paying attention to strategically.
Well, I think you have to do both. I think because as I said before, I think you do have, hackers maybe at both ends of the spectrum, ones who are, working with the known strategies. I mean, one of the big breakthroughs in the last decade or so is on fracking, which is actually a combination of two known technologies that existed for decades before that. And it's something that a lot of people didn't discount it as happening. But at the same time, you want to keep your eye on some of the cutting edge ones, because those are happening as I said before, in the biotech field. Mm-hmm. So it's not a matter of either or. I mean, and I think what we're all expressing up here is that, the spectrum here of things that you have to keep your eye on, and this is what General Dempsey was saying, is so much larger, and that's not going to go away.
How do nation states, go about that process of watching the entire landscape, Moises, and then deciding what to prioritize and what doesn't require as much attention? Because you can't watch everything 100%.
With great difficulty, of course, and depends on which state it is. But it also hinges on the nature that specific nation state, the calculation it makes of who are its rivals, who are the most likely challengers and enemies that it will confront, and what kind of conflict is more likely. And that is, I think the point we're all making is that calculation is becoming more difficult. It was easier to do when you had a finite number of enemies that you could spy on, that you could identify, that you focus very. When you have this proliferation of actors, it becomes very difficult. There is an example that I think is very revealing. If I have a minute, I
Please.
can. It is the convergence. What happens if these three very disruptive technologies, IADs, drones, and cyber weapons converge and become one? And so there was this incident in Dresden last September. Angela Merkel was giving a speech, a stump speech. The campaign was going well. She was about to be reelected. This is Sunday afternoon, blue skies, the town squares in Dresden. She's giving a speech. She's in a podium like this, standing up with other dignitaries. The Minister of Defense was there, and then you hear a buzz. And the buzz is a drone, a very small drone that comes and appears and stops just in front of her. And you could see her face, surprised and smiling and not knowing what's happening. And you could see the Minister of Defense looking panicked, and then the drone crashes. And the security takes the drone, and 1 hour after that, a political party called the Pirate Party claims responsibility and says, we did this because this is our way of calling attention to what it feels to be, targeted by a drone. So how do I know this? Because it's in YouTube. Just Google Dresden, Angela Merkel, and drone, and you'll see exactly what I have described. And so my point is, imagine that drone would have highly advanced GPS and other precision technologies. Imagine that drone, instead of having a camera, as it did, it had an IED. And imagine that instead of being there, would have been at a stadium with thousands of people. So when you think about that, and you think that that very powerful transformational weapon can be in the hands of almost anyone, then I think it's time to start thinking in very different ways about the calculations about the weapon systems and how you develop them. And I think what happened with IEDs is very revealing. As Andrew said, IEDs are very primitive, are very basic. And the United States literally spent billions of dollars, billions, in trying to create a way of defending the troops from IEDs, and it's still not working. So that I think signals the kind of choices and dilemmas and challenges ahead.
Is there space in this sphere, Andrew, for, I guess good, for lack of a better word, non-state actors to be involved here? We assume that the non-state actors are bad, I guess because of the history that we have during the War on Terror, but one would think that if groups with good intentions chose to become involved in this geopolitical sphere, they could certainly leverage technology in the same way.
I think if we open our thinking a little bit, one, I would have said earlier when we were talking about where pockets of innovation will be, I don't think about states when I think about pockets of innovation. I think it's sectors, it's communities, it's commercial life, and we can see it around the globe in various ways. And if you want to think of that in terms of non-state actors, I think, very much I would add that to the mix of where we have real opportunity here and where I think partnership can form that would allow us to find advantageous applications of technology and not just simply disruptive or threatening applications. And I think you do see that emerging in various ways. The comments we've heard about cyber and cyber vulnerabilities and so forth, the commercial sector is very much focused on this, and I think some of the new rules that we're going to see are going to be emerging from that. States will adopt those, but states probably aren't going to create those rules because they're going to emerge out of need from those parties that really are finding to have to write them. So yeah, I think to your question, we ought to be looking at what those sources are, and we ought to be, and understanding that this won't come through the focal point of states or state control of this, but it's where those pockets of interest reside, both in an innovative sense, but also in helping establish and create this new order, because they need it as well.
Mm-hmm. Matt, how do those partnerships look? Because one potential risk I see is if a state actor becomes involved with a non-state actor, the appearance of co-opting the non-state actor or a puppet-type relationship would seem to be potentially very easy, at least to project if it's not true.
Yeah, I think the bigger challenge is actually to get, in terms of the U.S. government, to actually have public-private partnerships, because there are a lot of legal constraints about that ability actually to develop those partnerships. And I think that way, what Andrew was talking about on the private sector side, I think they're farther ahead. That they know how to develop these networks, and in many ways, who develops a better network and across a far more diverse set of actors is going to be the one that's ahead. I think if we continue to worry a lot about whether this is going to do damage to us, meaning the U.S. government, or damage to the private sector, if we associate with them, I think it's going to paralyze us in what we should be thinking about, which is the really establishment of these partnerships and networks. Now, I think the private sector actors, when they're associating with the government, I think a lot of them, in my experience, are already aware of maybe the costs of doing that. But then there are ways of not maybe having a formal association, but still cooperating informally. But if we get too caught up in what are the costs here and there, I think we'll stop ourselves from what we should be doing in government.
Moises, the partnership notion is potentially powerful for United States government and for the NATO members that are going through financial situations that require them to scale back rather than to continue to invest and spend more in their national security efforts. What is the meaning on the other side of that, where General Dempsey referred to his Russian counterpart, saying that they're running full speed ahead? China indicates it's running full speed ahead in increasing its spending on national security.
So yeah, I just first want to call attention that as we were talking, someone was tweeting, and they tweeted the Angela Merkel scene that I just mentioned. It was just on the screens. I'm just fascinated by the speed of these things. The other comment I wanted to make in line with what you just said about, you asked Matt about the dangers and the risks of a nation state co-opting a non-state actor. That was the question. That's the least of our problems. A bigger problem today and looking forward is a non-state actor co-opting a state.
Yeah, interesting.
And I'm thinking especially at the emergence and the ascent of what we call mafia states. These are highly criminalized nation states, and I think General Dempsey included it in. That was his two, the two networks that he referred. One is Al-Qaeda, and the other is the large-scale transnational criminal networks that are very important. And before my book, Before the End of Power, was titled Illicit, and it looked at the ascent and the ascent of these criminal networks and the difficulty that nation states had to fend them off, and how these criminal networks who are for profit are able to take over and become and capture either very important segments of nation states, or actually the entire functioning of the nation state is at the service of those criminal interests. And you could trace some foreign policy, international policy, financial policy, international financial policy decisions are driven not by the national interest of that nation, but the interest of protecting the networks and the criminals that run them, that are in fact deeply entrenched in that state. And we saw elements of that. You asked about the financial crisis. We also saw elements of that there.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, again, you're agreeing with Moises as he's talking about the worry being not the way I had it, but the exact opposite way around.
Well, I don't want to dismiss the way you had it. I think there was something to be observed there. I think there's a observation I'd like to make as well. When if many of us have been working inside and outside of government for a long time, and if we were to go back and re-examine the assumptions that we had, say, 10 or 15 years ago of how this world would be unfolding, I think we would find ourselves humbled by the assumptions that we'd made, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And so you pointed to China or Russia, and in the case of China 10 or 15 years ago, people saw this as a development. People saw China's progression unfolding in a way, but they really viewed it as something of a 20 or 30-year problem. In fact, in most people's minds, this was a 30-year issue. This was something that we were going to be facing in terms of China's emergence as a security challenger in a disruptive way, 2025, 2030, and now we're 15 years ahead of that, and we're looking at that in a very serious way in terms of what that might mean. I think very few people had Russia in mind at all in terms of where its security investments were going and so forth. And certainly having been involved in a number, we referred earlier to the QDR or quadrennial defense reviews. I was inside the government working on, I think, 4 of them in various ways. And, the kinds of assumptions we were making about Russia and those weren't capturing that notion. So there is a notion of speed that's happening here in which activities can unfold. I'm not disputing what Moises is pointing out, because I think we have to account for that challenge as well. But I want to finish on one thought, and that is we still have considerable advantages. And I made the point earlier about partnerships around the world. I don't want to take them for granted, because I think every one of those partnerships around the world is being redefined in some very important way. but it is still quite an important American advantage. I think it's one that we ought to be mindful of, and as we look at Europe or we look at East Asia today, I think very reliable and important set of partnerships that we can work to position ourselves. My biggest worry is when I look at the Middle East, because I'm not sure I see the sort of natural checks or adaptations in place that would lead me to a kind of future that I think would be more comforting.
So no doubt we're being thoughtful about the technological advantages we have in the geopolitical space. Are we being thoughtful enough, and are we considering enough how we can leverage those technological advantages to our benefit?
I'm not sure we know as well yet the levers or leverage that we can gain from that and how that unfolds. And what's interested me in this discussion and the comments of the other panelists has really been highlighting is that the sources of influence aren't necessarily coming from the capitals of these states. And the sources of influences are really quite diffused. We began that on this notion of diffusion. I think there are many positive sources of influence, but how they're arrayed and where the various stakeholders are approached and aligned in various ways, I think that's all happening in very different ways today. And it certainly isn't happening through all of our capitals. I spend much of my time on the West Coast, and I have to say, when I'm on the West Coast, the idea that Washington is sort of the center of activity or the eye of the needle through which all things move, yeah, that isn't a view at all that's shared on the West Coast, and that's one that when I travel elsewhere in the world, that isn't the view anymore as well. So
and Moises, that's just within the United States of America. So I imagine that is magnified when you go outside of our borders, and other countries consider our policies, and other countries consider each other's policies, and then we throw the non-state actors and so on into the mix, and it really is a witch's brew like we haven't seen before, I would imagine.
With huge space for misunderstanding, miscalculations, and distorting what's going on. If those of you that travel around the world and talk to leaders elsewhere, it's quite amazing how distorted often is their perception of what's going on in Washington. In the same way that Washington distorts what's going on in Beijing or in Brussels. So it is. I never cease to be perplexed by the fact that we live in an age in which, in theory, everyone knows everything or can know everything, and we have access to all of the newspapers. In theory, we should be sharing a common base of information around the world. At least you would expect that policymakers and elites have a similar basic shared sense of what's going on, and that's not the case. I am always surprised either because the information does not flow as much as we think, or the huge space for misunderstanding and how people miscalculate, including people in the West Coast. You talk to some of the folks there in California and in Silicon Valley, and their perception of what's going on in Washington is very distorted in the same way that ours is about them. But that's a paradox of our age that is quite striking, I think.
We're looking forward to hearing from you in just a moment, but to wrap up my questions, Matt, what does that decentralization of understanding mean for setting our understanding of how technology will impact the way that we interact with all these other folks? If we're not even sure of what the messages are that they want to convey, or if we're not sure that we're receiving what they want us to know?
Well, I think analyzing and understanding what is happening, is very important and can be a very important asset for government as well as in the private sector. But one of those things that we probably don't do enough of in Washington is get the diversity of views. Because I think tendency is in Washington particularly, but I think in other capitals as well, is to be very intensely focused on ourselves and the different actors in kind of our own little sphere, not understanding the dynamics happening elsewhere. And, to get again, I think it's an interesting issue and particularly serious issue now for government is how do you get that? Those different points of view, how do you get that diversity of view and looking at some of the kind of the weak signals as well as what is right there in front of you. And we haven't mastered that ability yet. But along with doing strategic decision making, I think if we would have that ability, then you give a huge leg up in terms of our power.
Moises, that sounds like a cultural change that has to happen, not a structural change. I mean, what Matt is talking about is easily doable. It's wanting to do it and wanting to do it for genuine purposes and not just to say we're doing it. That information collection seems to be a cultural issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a very good point. I would only add that when Matt says what we don't do enough of in Washington, and he's right, you know, I would only add that that's governments are not very good at doing that. And so, you know, the idea would be that others, and there is something going on why others in the media or in Hollywood or though designing video games are not more effective at conveying these realities, and in fact sometimes are part of the noise. But again, how do you create a better, a more robust, shared base of information on which people can act, decide? It's a challenge, and I don't think governments can do it quite well because, again, it's becoming the proliferation of factors that can shape that conversation overwhelms any government.
So, Andrew, let's throw all of these things that we've talked about into the mix. Overall, do you believe technology is a net eroder or a net consolidator for sovereignty for nation states?
Oh, I think I squarely put myself on the side of eroder. Doesn't mean it has to be disadvantageous, but I think it is an erosion. It's an eroder.
Moises,
no doubt.
Agree?
Yeah.
Matt? Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thank you very much for the conversation. We have questions from the audience already. We have a microphone over here, and we'll start with this gentleman closest to me with his hand raised.
Peter Sharpman, Miter Corporation. Isn't Russia providing a good example of how a decent-sized nation state can act in an agile way and can find ways of exploiting the diffusion of power instead of being frustrated by it?
Two parts to your answer. I think in the immediate circumstances that we're seeing in Crimea and now eastern Ukraine, yes. I think beyond that, though, there are some very natural checks on that use of power. That's where I would really look to the United States and its NATO partners to act. And by the way, it doesn't mean this is all going to happen. It doesn't mean that it won't take effort. But I think it is within the wherewithal of the United States and its NATO powers to check that application beyond what we're seeing right there. So I think very good and very agile application, as you see, but I think limits to it that can be checked.
What we have seen in the developments in the way Russia has taken over Crimea and how is it destabilizing parts of Ukraine is essentially the very astute use of a global trend, and that is the ascent of civil society. In practice, Ukraine and Crimea was not taken over by a foreign occupation army. It was taken over by civil society. You know, these were probably Russian soldiers without insignias and without markings. But they came in not as an occupying army. They came in as civil society. They were people that believed in the need for Crimea to be Russian. The same is happening elsewhere. It's fascinating in Venezuela, for example. The influence of Cuba is quite significant. Venezuela's very significant functions of the Venezuelan state today are carried out from Havana, and Cuba has taken over a very important, it has a lot of power in Venezuela, and this is the country with one of the largest oil reserves in the world. They didn't do it by sending an army or sending an army dressed and uniformed as an army. They did it by sending civil society, doctors and trainers and all kinds of NGOs masquerading or all kinds of security and intelligence and military operatives masquerading as activists. And I think that's a trend we're going to see more of. The more civil society becomes a factor, more smart governments are going to convert their armed forces into NGO lookalikes.
I think Russia has a certain advantage here, that it has very much a narrative that everybody has bought into in Russia, that they got a very bad deal in the 90s, that this is a way of recovering their dignity, and that, you know, I think it is actually harder for the U.S. as a global power. If you're thinking of how do you set these broad global rules, and you have so many different interests and concerns, it's a harder role to play than a Russia that is, you know, in a sense trying to get back what it saw as its rightful own in the case of Crimea, and also to get its rightful place in terms of being a great power.
We'll go back to the audience in a moment, but I want to follow up on that description, Moises, of the civil society model. It seems to me that makes response and reaction more difficult on the one hand, because you don't know who the bad actors really are and what their intentions are. On the other hand, it makes it easier because it seems that dealing with those kinds of situations requires less hard kinetic force and potentially more diplomacy, which might make policy decisions in capitals easier. Am I on track there, do you think?
I think you do. You are, except that, well, again, the difficulty is who are we talking about on the other side?
Yeah.
When you have these thousands of fragmented actors, no one really responding to a centralized authority. I think the case I mentioned of Crimea and Ukraine with the Russian perspective is a very unique one. But in other places, you have a lot of different actors. We saw that in Afghanistan and Iraq, in which, you know, and we're seeing it in Syria, in which you have, you know, who are the real interlocutors there? If you have all these kinds of fragmented groups, again, perhaps no one with enough power to impose its views, but everyone with enough power to block everybody else. Mm-hmm. And so, when you think about doing using diplomacy, diplomacy requires to have a very clear interlocutor. And what's happening is that as the interlocutors become more diffused, the effectiveness of diplomacy declines accordingly.
Next question from the audience. This lady right here.
Audrey Kurth-Cronin from George Mason University. I wanted to ask about the cyber area, and particularly the question of what would happen in the aftermath of a major disruption of data. Isn't it true that the first responders would be private industry, not the government, and that our tendency is to talk about the government and to see this from a kind of a Washington or even a military perspective, but especially in the wake of the Snowden affair and all the other revelations at NSA, there's a huge disinclination of the private sector to work with the public sector. What do you think?
Who would like to start that one? Andy?
I can offer a few words. I think it's not, I think even before, I think it's a terrific issue, and I think even before the revelations of the Snowden affair, that there was a very reluctance among the private sector to invite the government in, or to invite even other parties in part because of a reluctance to have made known the very great vulnerabilities. And this isn't a new phenomena. I think, since the banking industry has certainly been experiencing this for some time, and it runs throughout various sectors. The issue of disruption, I think, I thought General Dempsey's characterization earlier this morning was a very important one, because denial is one thing, and denial, in my observations, particularly in national security, in the world of national security, denial is one in which there are sort of measures and adaptations available. Disruption, an altogether different problem, and I think people aren't accustomed to it. And I certainly know, even from my observations of ongoing exercises and plans and activities, that too often it is about denial, so we no longer have access to this. Very infrequently is it about disruption. So I don't even know that there are mechanisms in place in which adaptation can happen. So to your question about, you know, is it likely to be the private sector? I think the answer is yes. I think the adaptations are going to happen there, and I wouldn't expect necessarily there's going to be, you know, an invitation of the public sector into the inner workings of that, and that could be very problematic.
Yeah?
One of my colleagues here, Jay Healy, has written a book. Basically, it goes back over a couple of decades and examines those periods when you had cyber disruptions, and it was the private sector and all the cases that came forward and actually provided the solutions and the rules. So yes, I think there is a tendency, going back maybe to what we were saying about Washington living in a certain bubble, not seeing that it is the private sector is often going to be the ones that come to the aid first of everybody in a crisis.
Is that model, though, common around the world, do you think? I mean, in the United States, of course, the private sector owns most of the cyber infrastructure. That's not necessarily the case in every country around the world. So is it possible that the answer to that question in another country would be dramatically different than it is here?
Yes, I mean, particularly when, you know, some of the industries and so on are very much controlled by governments elsewhere. That would be the case. It would be much more government-led.
Moises, you agree?
You know, I agree with that. They're fully. Yeah.
So then would it depend on where the potential cyber threat is coming from, what it's directed against, or maybe a combination of both to determine who the first responder is and what the kind of response is likely to be?
In the cyber attacks we have had in recent years, not just here, but also in other countries, we still don't know. You know, it's highly speculative, and you know, some people have very firm opinions about who are the sources of these attacks, but they're open to debate. So one of the problems with cyber attacks is that it's very hard to identify precisely and without any doubt where it came from.
Next question. Right here in the front row.
Hi there, George Lund from Torchill. I want to see about maybe trying to elevate some of this a little bit and pick up on Moises' sort of deadly triangle, and then link that to, not to get into any debate about specific numbers, but unemployment in the United States to some degree in terms of how we measure our sort of underemployed. But in Europe, to a very great degree, very high rates of unemployment, power diffused so that individuals and even small groups can create great disruption. I thought maybe the group could just talk a little bit about the possibility of radicalization sort of around the world, where generally there were not means, and now I think there are means, as has just been discussed. You know, the national right-wing parties growing in France, growing in other places. This is sort of the re-entry maybe of geopolitics in a certain way. Just throw that open for comment.
People can obviously communicate in ways that they couldn't communicate with each other even 5 years ago, let alone 10 or 20. What are the implications for groups that we can't even wrap our arms around to be able to get together and use some of the technologies that we've talked about? I mean, that's what we've seen in any number of countries throughout the Middle East and Africa especially. Andy?
I want to come back to earlier part of the discussion because I think it's relevant to this. Moises' point about the penetration of civil society and how that works. I think that's not a tool only available to those that we think are sort of challenging our position or challenging notions of order. Let's not forget it was only a few months ago that I think it was Moscow accusing the West of doing that as the Ukrainian government was losing its grip and its position. And, you know, and it wasn't all that long ago that even Moscow itself was facing, you know, a real upheaval of turbulence in Putin's own position. threatened in ways in Moscow. And so, and I think very much the perception that this wasn't just necessarily sort of an internal wellspring of activity, but it was inspired from the outside, and there were a lot of accusations to the West. And so I think we ought to be cognizant of that. I think to the question that interests me is not only how we could see these activities forming in various ways because of notions of dislocation or the notions of parts of populations that aren't connected to their societies, but even the backsliding of some of those societies themselves. As I mentioned earlier, I think NATO and its partners have real advantages to check what's happening in Russia today, and we can have similar discussions around elsewhere in the world. I think one of the real dangers, though, we have to keep in mind is the idea of democracies hold within NATO Europe itself. And so as we look at Eastern Europe and we look at what's happening there, to me, I think as worrisome as what I'm watching in Ukraine or the Crimea is sort of a backsliding of democracy's grip on some of the East European partners that are inside the European Union, that are part of NATO, and part of that has to do with the issues that you're talking about of the disaffection of parts of those societies and the attraction of more authoritarian forms of government, and where all that goes. I think something very much for us to be watching.
Please.
I mean, I think this is a critical point on the fragmentation, that in many ways that you have this globalization going on at one level in which everybody seems to be all boats being rising, and everybody aspiring in some ways to the same things of prosperity. But I think you're also seeing incredible amount of fragmentation with this, what we call individual empowerment. And that when you're talking about radicalization, you have this, witch's brew of the new technologies that can create a whole virtual reality for, young people to live in, where they don't even can understand the difference between the virtual reality and that virtual reality can be manipulated by radical groups, by terrorist groups, really. And oftentimes societies are incredibly fragmented, and some of the most prosperous ones particularly fragmented, because you have this huge urbanization going on, so a lot of people migrating, getting away from their family structures, looking for opportunities in the city, trying to establish their own communities within that, but that's oftentimes a very difficult process, and a lot of people losing out as well. So that I think you will find this to be a very kind of the normal part of this very rapid change that is happening, but nevertheless very disturbing. And I think the technologies in some ways accentuate this more fragmentary side.
Moises, the fragmentation reason is what organizations like the National Security Agency use for saying we need to collect this information and we need to analyze this, and yet they have run up, obviously, against a lot of resistance from Congress and from the general public. So I wonder about navigating that balance between situational awareness of what this fragmentation is causing and not being so aware that you create a sense that you're looking under people's beds.
And that tension is going to be with us for a while. If you look at opinion polls, it varies depending on how worried the public opinion is about an accident. If we have another terrorist attack, a large-scale terrorist attack in this country, you will see changes in the public opinions about how they now, the indignant and in some ways highly justified reactions to the NSA eavesdropping and use of metadata and all that. That will, I hope it never happens, but if there is a terrorist attack, you will see shifts in public opinion concerning the tolerance for the government's use of surveillance techniques and highly intrusive ways of gathering information. However, and going back to the question about how economic malaise feeds into political violence and political instability, one of the surprises of this recent economic crisis is how little political violence it has engendered. We have seen some of it in Greece and of course, some of the Arab Spring before. Tunisia was clearly driven by problems that were not driven by is the counterexample for this, because Tunisia had a very good economic performance, and yet it had a very disaffected population. But if you think about it, in Europe and other places that were hard hit by the economic downturn, and where living standards, unemployment rates, especially about the young, are very, very high, you have not seen the reaction. People becoming more aggressive and taking, convert. We have not seen a lot of the conversion of economic malaise into political violence. We have seen some of that, but one would have expected to see more, and it didn't happen. Thus far, religion and ideology and politics continue to be the main primary driver of terrorism. And it may be that these are the mediating factors of the economic malaise. The economic malaise just creates a witch's brew that then leads people towards religious extremist or political extremism.
Andrew, do you see any reason for that trend to change, that economic malaise could eventually lead to directly to radicalization of some sort, not necessarily religious radicalization?
I think we don't know. I think I'm siding very squarely with Moises on this, in the sense that people have speculated for a long time, and not just for 3 or 4 years, but for several decades, that we'd be witnessing this, the notion of youth bulges, high unemployment, and so forth in various parts of the world that would lead necessarily to political instability and to forming of new forms of new entities and so forth that would challenge not only state structures but global order in various ways. I think we don't know. I think it's the evidence on that is very mixed, and so I think to point to it as a dominant trend or a dominant indicator, I think. I don't think the evidence is sufficient to be able to draw a conclusion.
Another one? Right here?
Thank you for your comments. My name is August Cole. I'm a writer and a fellow at the American Security Project. To take your comments earlier about the diffusion of power and the erosion of sovereignty, couldn't one opposite effect, though, be a rise of nationalism, in the sense, to draw together the comments from General Dempsey about too much choice? People want something simpler. Rallying around one flag is often easier than trying to identify with multiple groups.
Yeah, I agree with that. The question is about nationalism and contrasting nationalism and the ascent and the importance of nationalism in contrast with globalization and these forces of integration and all that. And we have seen that. And we have seen nationalism doesn't go away and continues to be a very powerful force and a very defining force. And it's very interesting to see how countries that have a very, very intense, powerful nationalistic streak see it in others and not in themselves. The United States is a highly nationalistic nation that sees nationalism more in others than here.
Matt, we talked earlier about the advantages that nation states have. That certainly seems to be one of them. Is that one that nation states like the United States are leveraging sufficiently, and is it possible to over-leverage nationalism, as Russia and China are accused of doing from time to time?
Well, I think it's very possible to over-leverage nationalism. I mean, we have huge histories of all sorts of countries over-leveraging nationalism and getting themselves into really deep trouble. I think, I would say, agree with Moises that I think Americans are very nationalistic, but I would think the point too is here that we also have a divided country in many ways, and a country that I think is going to be increasingly divided. I mean, some of this is reflected through the economic inequality, but I think some of it too is cultural divides. And I think part of the problem, if you were to ask me about the U.S., is actually that you don't have a consensus. That, I think my comment earlier about Russia having this narrative that people buy in, I'm not sure that there is this powerful narrative in the U.S. I think there are lots of narratives, but they don't seem to converge anywhere. And that I think, the Chinese also have a very powerful narrative, and that is that they're going to overcome this past century of humiliation, and that they all need to pull together. U.S., I'm not sure that at times we don't seem to want to be the global power we are, that we want to retrench, get back. At other times, we think that others don't appreciate the role that we've played. So there are various contending forces, and I think it's a period actually for the U.S. in which we haven't gotten our act together, even though we're very patriotic, very nationalistic as Americans, but not knowing exactly maybe what that means at this point.
I'll take your point on the over-leveraging examples and how many of them there are, but they don't seem to turn out well. They over-leveraging nationalism always seems to end to the detriment of whoever started it in the first place, at least to the examples that I can think of, and that's kind of what where I was headed by that idea. Is there a balance in there where you can really emphasize nationalism in the kind of environment that we're talking about? And to take it back to the original topic, where we are today technologically, or are there too many mitigating forces to call attention to the fact that maybe the emperor has no clothes?
Yeah, I think this discussion it's had me pondering as well. I was reflecting on those circumstances, I think, much as you were. I find myself concerned, however, in the sense that it's quite a force to be unleashed. I think it's a terrific question that you're raising here. One not necessarily easily controlled once unleashed, and I think one in which the diffusion that we're talking about, it doesn't necessarily mean that all will go the way of those unleashing sort of those impulses, but that diffusion could really mean this could run in very dangerous courses. And in my own mind, when I look at where that's playing out, I think East Asia is the circumstance where I'm most concerned of how those impulses could really run out of control. And I think certainly one in which I think every effort ought to be taken to play a steady hand, in the sense that where we are able to do so, but of course the unleashing of those impulses aren't under our control. And I think certainly I would be in a position of offering every caution to those that might be choosing to do that.
We just have a few moments left, and I would like to ask each of you kind of what's the icing on the cake here? What are the things we should take away from this conversation? The defining elements in your view. Matt, we'll start with you, please.
Well, I think one of the defining elements is that, and it starts maybe with what General Dempsey was saying, is that we're in this era of what we see as kind of constant crisis. And if we want to make some headway, I think we need to figure out how you do decision making in this world. I think you have to accept that this is going to be the pattern going forward. So how do you deal with it? And I think we had a conversation earlier. I mean, we've spent years talking, complaining about the situation, that we can't seem to get ahead of the curve, but we don't seem to do anything about it, particularly in adapting how we do business. And I think that's for me, the big takeaway here.
Moises?
3 points. First, technology, size, and resources do not convey and do not provide the same levels of military advantage they did in the past. They continue to be very important, but they are not as defining as they used to be. Second is military affairs will be disrupted in profound, unexpected ways coming from sources and players and actors that are completely unpredictable and are not going to come necessarily from governments and nation states. And third is the proliferation of players with the ability to deny options to the established traditional players is going to be a constant transformational fact of the landscape.
Mr. Ho, in the last word.
I think I'll finish with one broad point that I think captures some of the spirit of this discussion, and that is the world that we face today really is one in which there are very new sources of power and influence, unfamiliar in many ways, unfamiliar even to the world of 10 or 15 years ago, and certainly of 30 or even 15 years ago. I think the challenge for the world of policy is how to harness and leverage those sources, and we're seeing them manifested in various ways. But to those in the world of strategy, it's really coming to understand what those sources are, and then how to harness and leverage them in effective ways.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for this terrific conversation. It's been wonderful and a privilege to be a part of it. Thank you for your attention, knowing that the coffee break was ready to start. I appreciate you continuing and sticking with us. We're going to break for about 10 minutes, and the discussion will continue in just a few moments. And again, thank you very much.